The rain hammered against the windows of Murphy's Diner in downtown Portland, Oregon, creating rivulets that distorted the neon signs across the street. It was nearly midnight on a Tuesday in November, and the diner was almost empty except for a few late-shift workers nursing coffee and the occasional trucker stopping for a meal. 62-year-old Frank Morrison wiped down the counter for the third time that hour, his weathered hands moving in practiced motions. He had owned Murphy's Diner for 15 years, ever since he'd saved enough money from his construction job to buy the struggling restaurant. From old Murphy himself, the work was hard, but Frank preferred the solitude of late-night shifts. It gave him time to think, and sometimes time to forget. The bell above the door chimed, and Frank looked up to see a figure silhouetted against the stormy night. A young girl, maybe 14 or 15, stepped inside, her thin jacket soaked through, and her dark hair plastered to her head. She stood uncertainly by the door, water pooling at her feet, her eyes scanning the diner with the wariness of someone who had learned not to trust easily. "Come on in, sweetheart," Frank called gently, grabbing a clean towel from behind the counter. "You're soaked to the bone." The girl approached cautiously, accepting the towel with a quiet thank you. Up close, Frank could see she was painfully thin, her clothes worn and too big for her small frame. Her eyes held a maturity that no child should possess, the look of someone who had seen too much, too soon. "What's your name?" Frank asked, pouring a cup of hot coffee without being asked. "Emma," she replied softly, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. "Emma Rodriguez." "Well, Emma, I'm Frank. You hungry? You look like you could use a good meal." Emma's eyes darted toward the door, then back to Frank. "I don't have any money." "Did I ask for money?" Frank was already moving toward the grill, cracking eggs and laying strips of bacon in the pan. "When's the last time you ate something hot?" Emma was quiet for a long moment. "Yesterday, I think. Maybe the day before." Frank's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice calm. "Where are you staying?" "Emma." "Around," she said evasively, taking a sip of coffee, "here and there." Frank had worked with enough runaway kids over the years to recognize the signs, the carefully vague answers, the hypervigilance, the way she positioned herself with a clear view of both the door and the back exit. He had been exactly where she was sitting 37 years ago, as he placed a plate of eggs, bacon, hash browns, and toast in front of her. Frank made a decision that would change both their lives. "Emma, I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to know there's no judgment here, okay? Are you living on the streets?" Emma's hand froze halfway to her mouth, a forkful of eggs suspended in the air. For a moment, Frank thought she might bolt. Instead, tears began to well up in her eyes. "I aged out," she whispered. "Foster care. I turned 18 3 months ago, and they just said good luck and sent me on my way. But I lied. About my age. I'm really only 15. Frank felt a familiar ache in his chest, a pain he thought he had buried decades ago. "What happened to your family?" "Never had one." "Really? My mom left me at a fire station when I was 2. Said in the note that she couldn't take care of me, that I was too much trouble." Emma's voice was matter-of-fact, but Frank could hear the years of hurt beneath the words. "Been in the system ever since. 16 different homes." Frank sat down. Across from her, his own coffee growing cold. "Emma, what if I told you that you don't have to spend another night on the streets?" She looked up at him suspiciously. "What do you mean?" "I mean I have an apartment upstairs. It's not much, but it's warm and dry. You could stay there tonight, get cleaned up, get some real sleep, no strings attached." "Why would you do that?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't even know me." Frank was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the rain-soaked street. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old memories. "Because 37 years ago, I was sitting in a diner just like this one, scared and alone and wondering if anyone in the world gave a damn whether I lived or died. Someone helped me that night, Emma. Someone who didn't have to, but did anyway." Emma studied his face, searching for deception and finding none. "What happened to your family?" "Pretty much the same story as yours. My mother dropped me off at a children's home when I was 6, said she couldn't handle a kid anymore, that I was cramping her style. Frank's weathered hands wrapped around his coffee mug. I spent the next 12 years in and out of foster homes, group homes, juvenile facilities. Aged out at 18 with nothing but the clothes on my back and a lot of anger. But you made it, Emma said softly. I made it, but it took me a long time to figure out how to live instead of just survive. Had some help along the way from people who saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. Emma finished her meal in silence, and Frank could practically see the wheels turning in her head when she finally spoke. Her voice was small and vulnerable. If I stay tonight, what happens tomorrow? Tomorrow, we figure out tomorrow. One day at a time. Emma, that's how it works. As Frank led Emma upstairs to the small but clean apartment above the diner, he couldn't shake the feeling that this moment had been inevitable somehow. All those years of working late nights, of keeping the diner open when it might have been more profitable to close early, had led to this, a scared 15-year-old girl who needed exactly what he could offer: understanding, safety, and the knowledge that someone cared. Emma stood in the doorway of the apartment, taking in the modest living room with its worn but comfortable furniture, the small kitchen, and the view of the city lights through rain-streaked windows. Frank, she said quietly. Yeah, thank you. Frank handed her some clean towels and pointed toward the bathroom. Get warmed up, Emma. Tomorrow's a new day. As he heard the shower running, Frank sat in his favorite chair and stared out at the Portland skyline. He had spent so many years convinced that his painful childhood had been nothing but a source of suffering. Tonight, for the first time, he began to understand that maybe all that pain had a purpose, to prepare him for this moment, when he could be the person for Emma that someone had once been for him. 2 weeks had passed since Emma first walked into Murphy's diner, and Frank was amazed at the transformation already taking place. The wary, frightened girl who had barely spoken above a whisper was beginning to show glimpses of the intelligent, spirited young woman she was meant to be. Emma had settled into a routine. She helped Frank in the diner during the slower afternoon hours, learning to work the register and taking orders from the regular customers, who had quickly adopted her as their own. In return, Frank made sure she had regular meals, clean clothes, and for the first time in her life, a stable place to sleep. But Frank knew there were bigger issues to address. Emma hadn't been to school in months, and her legal status was complicated. That's why he had asked his friend, Sarah Chen, a social worker he had met through the community center, to come by the diner on this particular Tuesday afternoon. Emma, Frank called from behind the counter as Sarah walked in. I'd like you to meet someone. Emma emerged from the back room where she had been restocking supplies, immediately on guard when she saw the unfamiliar woman. Her experience with social workers had not been positive. It's okay, Frank said gently, recognizing Emma's defensive posture. Sarah's a friend. She's here to help. Sarah, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a gentle manner, extended her hand to Emma. I've heard a lot about you, Emma. Frank tells me you've been a real asset to the diner. Emma shook Sarah's hand cautiously. Are you here to take me back into the system? No, Sarah said firmly. I'm here to help Frank become your legal guardian. If that's something you both want. Emma's eyes widened, and she looked back and forth between Frank and Sarah. Guardian. Frank moved closer, his voice warm but serious. Emma, these past 2 weeks have been, well, they've been some of the best I've had in a long time. I know we haven't known each other long, but I'd like to make this official. I'd like to be your family, if you'll have me. For a moment, Emma was speechless. Then the questions came tumbling out. But why? I mean, you barely know me. What if I mess up? What if I'm too much trouble? What if Emma? Frank interrupted, gently. What if you're exactly what my life has been missing? Sarah smiled as she watched the interaction. She had worked with hundreds of kids in the foster system, and she recognized something special happening here. There's a process we'll need to go through, she explained. Background checks, home visits, court hearings. But Frank has already passed the initial screening, and frankly, you're both lucky to have found each other over the next hour. Sarah explained the legal process while Emma listened intently, occasionally asking questions that showed her intelligence and maturity. Frank marveled at how articulate she became when discussing something that mattered to her. "There's something else we need to talk about," Sarah said gently. "Emma, you need to be back in school. I know your experiences with education have been challenging, given how often you moved between homes. But you're bright, and you deserve the chance to finish your education." Emma's face clouded. "I've been to so many schools. Every time I start to fit in somewhere, I get moved. The other kids always know I'm a foster kid. They look at you differently." Frank leaned forward. "What if I told you that Roosevelt High, just 6 blocks from here, has an excellent program for students in transitional situations?" Ms. Martinez, the guidance counselor there, used to work in the foster system herself. "You've already looked into it?" Emma asked, surprised. "I've been looking into a lot of things," Frank admitted. "Emma, I want you to have every opportunity I never had. That includes an education, but also things like learning to drive. Maybe even college someday, if that's what you want." Emma was quiet for a long moment. "No one's ever talked to me about college before." "Well, we're talking about it now," Frank said simply. That evening, after Sarah had left and the dinner rush had died down, Frank and Emma sat in the diner's back booth, going over the guardianship paperwork. Emma read every page carefully, asking questions about terms she didn't understand. "Frank," she said suddenly, looking up from the forms, "can I ask you something, anything? That night you said someone helped you when you were my age. What happened? I mean, if you want to tell me." Frank was quiet for a moment, then began to speak. "His name was Joe Martinez. He was Ms. Martinez's father, actually. He owned a garage on the east side of town. I was living in an abandoned building, stealing food to survive, getting into fights. One night, the police picked me up for breaking into a convenience store." Emma listened intently as Frank continued. "Joe was at the police station. His nephew had been arrested for joyriding. He saw me sitting there, 18 years old and angry at the world, and for some reason, he decided to get involved. He talked the store owner out of pressing charges, and then he offered me a job. Just like that. Just like that." Joe said he'd been an angry kid once too, and that someone had given him a chance. "He said that's how it works, you pass it forward." Frank smiled at the memory. "He taught me about cars, about work ethic, about treating people with respect. Most importantly, he taught me that where you come from doesn't have to determine where you're going." Emma absorbed this information. "What happened to him?" "He passed away about 10 years ago. Heart attack. But not before he got to see me by this place, make something of myself. He was proud, Emma, and I think he'd be proud to know that I'm trying to pass forward what he gave me." Emma reached across the table and placed her hand over Frank's weathered one. "I want to do the guardianship thing," she said quietly. "I want to go back to school. I want to try." Frank felt his eyes well up with tears he hadn't shed in years. "We'll try together, Emma. That's what families do." As they sat in the warm glow of the diner's lights, both of them understood that they were embarking on something neither had experienced before. A real family, built not on blood relations or legal obligations, but on mutual choice, understanding, and the shared knowledge of what it meant to be unwanted by the world, but cherished by each other. Outside, the Portland rain continued to fall, but inside Murphy's diner, to people who had started life as unwanted, we're discovering that sometimes the most meaningful families are the ones you choose. 3 months into their new arrangement, Frank and Emma faced their first real crisis. It started on a Monday morning when Emma came downstairs to the diner with red, puffy eyes and a letter clutched in her trembling hand. "Frank," she said, her voice barely audible, "I think I messed up." Frank looked up from prepping vegetables for the lunch rush, immediately concerned. In the months they'd been together, Emma had blossomed into a confident, hard-working young woman. She was excelling at Roosevelt High, had made friends with several classmates, and had even started talking about wanting to study social work in college. Seeing her this upset brought back all of Frank's protective instincts. "What's wrong?" "Sweetheart," Emma handed him the letter with shaking hands. It was from the school district's truancy office, stating that Emma Rodriguez had been reported as a runaway minor and that her enrollment at Roosevelt High was being investigated for fraud. Frank read the letter twice, his jaw tightening with each word. "Who reported you?" "I think it was Mrs. Patterson from my old foster home," Emma said, collapsing into a chair. "She saw me at the grocery store last week with you. She kept asking questions about where I was living, and I tried to avoid her." But Emma's voice broke. "Frank, what if they take me away? What if they say you kidnapped me or something?" Frank set the letter down and knelt beside Emma's chair, taking her hands in his. "Emma, look at me. We haven't done anything wrong. You're not a runaway. You aged out of the system, remember? And Sarah has been working on the guardianship paperwork. But I lied about my age," Emma whispered. "When I first went into care, someone made a mistake on my paperwork, and I never corrected it. I was so tired of being moved around, and I thought if I was older, maybe I could just disappear when I turned 18. Frank felt a surge of anger, not at Emma, but at a system that had failed this remarkable young woman so completely that she felt the need to lie just to survive. "Emma, we're going to handle this together. Let me call Sarah." Within an hour, Sarah Chen was sitting in the diner with Frank, Emma, and a man Frank had never met before, David Kim, a family law attorney who specialized in cases involving foster children. "Emma," David said gently, "I need you to tell me everything from the beginning. No matter how scared you are or how much trouble you think you might be in. We need the complete truth to help you." Over the next 2 hours, Emma's real story emerged. Her name was actually Emma Rodriguez, and she was 15, not 18. She had been placed in foster care as a toddler after her mother, struggling with addiction, left her at a fire station. The paperwork error that aged her up by 3 years had never been corrected, and Emma had learned to play the role of an older teenager to avoid scrutiny. "I've been in 16 different homes," Emma explained, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "Some were okay, some were not so good. Mrs. Patterson's house was the worst. She took in 5 foster kids, but it was just for the money. We barely had enough food, and she made us clean her house and take care of her own kids like we were servants." Frank's hands clenched into fists, but he kept his voice calm. "Why didn't you report her?" "Who would believe me?" Emma asked simply. "I was just another problem kid in the system. Mrs. Patterson always made sure we looked clean and fed whenever the social workers came by." David took notes as Emma spoke, occasionally asking clarifying questions. Sarah's face grew more troubled with each detail of Emma's experiences. "Emma," David said finally, "you're not in trouble. In fact, given what you've told me about your experiences, there are several laws that were broken by the people who we're supposed to be caring for. You Mrs. Patterson's allegations are baseless. You're a minor who found safe housing with an adult who's been properly vetted by the state." "So I can stay?" Emma asked, hardly daring to hope. "You can stay," Sarah confirmed. "In fact, Frank's guardianship petition has been approved pending the final home study next week. This complaint actually expedites the process." The relief on Emma's face was overwhelming, but Frank could see there was something else bothering her. "What is it, Em? I'm scared I'm going to mess this up somehow," she admitted. "Everyone who's ever taken me in has eventually decided I was too much trouble. What if you realize you made a mistake?" Frank was quiet for a long moment, then stood up and walked to a framed photograph hanging on the diner's wall. It showed a younger Frank standing next to Joe Martinez in front of the garage, where Frank had learned to work on cars. "Emma, come here," Frank said gently when she stood beside him. He pointed to the photo. "That's Joe Martinez, the man I told you about. See that kid standing next to him? That angry, scared kid who thought he wasn't worth anyone's time or effort." Emma studied the photograph. The young Frank looked defiant and wary, but there was something in Joe Martinez's expression, patience, kindness, and unwavering determination. "Joe took that picture on the day he officially became my guardian," Frank continued. "I was 19, but emotionally, I was about 12. I had failed at everything I'd ever tried. I had a juvenile record, and I honestly believed I was going to end up dead or in prison before I turned 21. "But you didn't," Emma said softly. "No, I didn't, because Joe saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. Just like I see something in you that you're still learning to see." Frank turned to face Emma directly. "Emma, you're not too much trouble. You're exactly enough. You're smart, you're kind, you work hard, and you've survived things that would have broken a lot of people. You're not a burden, you're a gift." Emma's tears came then, but they were different from the frightened tears she'd shed that morning. These were tears of relief, of hope, and of something she'd never really experienced before. The certainty that she was wanted and valued exactly as she was. David gathered his papers and stood to leave. "I'll handle Mrs. Patterson's complaint. Emma, you just focus on school and being a teenager. Frank, the final guardianship hearing is scheduled for next Friday at 2 p.m. After David and Sarah left, Frank and Emma worked side by side preparing for the lunch rush. The familiar routine was comforting, and Frank noticed that Emma's confidence had returned. "Frank," Emma said as she filled the napkin dispensers. "Yeah, next week, when the guardianship is official, would it be okay if I started calling you Dad?" Frank stopped what he was doing and looked at Emma, really looked at her. 3 months ago, she had been a frightened, homeless teenager who believed she was unwanted. Now she was asking to call him Dad, something he had never thought he would hear. "Emma," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I can't think of anything I'd like more." As the lunch customers began to arrive, Frank and Emma worked together with the easy rhythm of a real family. They had both learned that being unwanted by some people didn't mean being unworthy of love. It just meant waiting for the right people to come along and recognize your value. 1 year later, Murphy's Diner had become the heart of the neighborhood in ways Frank never could have imagined. What had started as a simple restaurant had evolved into something much more meaningful, a place where lost people found family, where second chances were served alongside the daily specials, and where Emma Rodriguez Morrison had grown into the confident, compassionate young woman she was always meant to be. It was a crisp October evening, and Frank stood behind the counter watching Emma help a new customer, a teenage boy who had the same wary, hungry look Emma had carried when she first walked through the door. The boy's name was Marcus, and he had been living in Riverside Park for 3 weeks after aging out of foster care at 18. "Here you go," Emma said, setting a plate of Frank's famous meatloaf and mashed potatoes in front of Marcus. "And don't worry about payment. My dad has a policy about that." Frank smiled at hearing Emma call him Dad so naturally. The guardianship had been finalized 10 months ago, and Emma had legally taken his last name, becoming Emma Rodriguez Morrison. She was now a sophomore at Roosevelt High, maintaining a 3.8 GPA and volunteering at the community center where she helped other foster kids navigate the educational system. "Emma's right," Frank said, approaching the table where Marcus sat. "The first meal's always on the house. After that, well, we'll see if you might be interested in earning your keep." Marcus looked up suspiciously. "What do you mean?" Emma sat down across from Marcus, and Frank marveled at how she instinctively knew how to connect with someone in his situation. "He means he's going to offer you a job and a place to stay, just like he did for me. Fair warning though, he's going to expect you to go back to school. I dropped out junior year," Marcus said quietly. "So did I," Emma replied matter-of-factly, "twice actually. But Roosevelt has a great program for people like us. Trust me, it's worth it." Frank watched this interaction with deep pride. Emma had become everything he had hoped she would, not despite her difficult past, but because of how it had shaped her empathy and resilience. She understood Marcus in a way that no traditionally raised teenager could, and she used that understanding to offer hope instead of pity. Later that evening, after Marcus had accepted Frank's offer of a job and a room above the diner, the same apartment where Emma had stayed before Frank converted the storage room into a proper bedroom for her, Emma and Frank sat in their favorite booth going over her college application essays. "Read me the personal statement one more time," Frank said, settling back with his coffee. Emma cleared her throat and began to read. "When I was 15 years old, I walked into Murphy's Diner, believing I was unwanted, unworthwhile, and destined for failure. I had spent my entire life being moved from place to place, told I was too much trouble, too damaged, too difficult to love. What I discovered that night was that sometimes the people who understand you best are the ones who have walked the same difficult path." Frank felt the familiar tightness in his throat that came whenever Emma talked about their early days together. Emma continued reading. "My guardian, Frank Morrison didn't save me out of pity or obligation. He recognized something in me because he had once been exactly where I was. He had been unwanted too, and that shared experience created a bond that biology never could have provided. Through his example, I learned that our worst experiences can become our greatest strengths when we use them to help others. That's why I want to study social work with a specialization in foster care reform. I want to work within the system that failed both Frank and me, not to criticize it, but to improve it. I want to help create more families like ours, families built on understanding, mutual choice, and the radical idea that everyone deserves to be wanted by someone. Emma looked up from the paper. What do you think? I think Portland State is lucky to be getting you, Frank said honestly. But more than that, I think Joe Martinez would be proud of how this all turned out. Emma smiled. I wish I could have met him. You would have liked him. He had the same gift you have, the ability to see potential where other people only see problems. Frank paused, then added, Emma, there's something I want to tell you. Something I've been thinking about a lot lately. Emma set down her essay and gave him her full attention. When Joe took me in, I used to wonder why he bothered. I caused him nothing but trouble for the first year, missed work, got into fights, pushed back against every rule he set. I was convinced he'd eventually give up on me like everyone else had. But he didn't, Emma said softly. No, he didn't. And for years, I thought his persistence was just because he was a good man with a big heart. But now I understand something else. Frank's voice grew thoughtful. Joe needed me as much as I needed him. Taking care of me, watching me grow and succeed. It gave his own difficult childhood meaning. It transformed his pain into purpose. Emma's eyes filled with understanding. Just like I needed you as much as you needed me. Exactly. Emma, you didn't just give me a daughter. You gave me a reason to believe that everything I went through, all the rejection, all the loneliness, all the times I felt unwanted, it all led to that night when you walked through that door. You made my life make sense. They were interrupted by the sound of laughter from the kitchen, where Marcus was helping the night cook clean up. The sound reminded Frank of Emma's first weeks at the diner, when her rare moments of joy had been like sunshine breaking through storm clouds. Do you think he'll be okay? Emma asked, nodding toward the kitchen. With you helping him navigate the system and showing him what's possible, I think he'll be more than okay, Frank replied. That's how this works, Em. Each person who finds their way here makes it easier for the next person. Emma gathered her college papers and stood up to head upstairs to finish her homework. At the foot of the stairs, she turned back to Frank. Dad, yeah, sweetheart. I know you always say you were the unwanted kid who got lucky, but I think you've got it backwards. Frank raised an eyebrow. How so? I think the world was waiting for you to become exactly who you needed to be so you could be here when I needed you. Same with Joe and you. Same with us and Marcus. Maybe being unwanted by some people is just the universe's way of saving us for the people who will want us completely. As Emma headed upstairs and Frank began closing up the diner for the night, he reflected on her words. Outside, Portland's city lights twinkled in the autumn darkness, and Frank could see his reflection in the window. No longer the angry, abandoned boy who had aged out of foster care decades ago, but a man who had found his purpose in giving other unwanted kids the family they deserved. On the wall behind the register, next to the old photo of Frank and Joe Martinez, hung a new picture, Frank and Emma on the day her guardianship became official, both of them beaming with the joy of people who had finally found where they belonged. Murphy's Diner would continue to be a beacon for lost souls, a place where unwanted children discovered they had been wanted all along. They just had to find the right person to recognize their worth. And in the apartment upstairs, Emma Rodriguez Morrison fell asleep knowing that tomorrow she would help another lost teenager understand that sometimes the most beautiful families are built from the shared understanding of what it means to be chosen rather than simply born into belonging. The cycle continued, as it always had and always would, love passing forward from one generation to the next, transforming pain into purpose, and proving that no one is truly unwanted when they find their way to the right heart.